So identification of birds is indeed pretty challenging, and there are lots of little clues that can help you along the way. Just to give you an example of how many species you might be able to see, here at our field station, over 200 different species have been recorded. One of the easiest things to cue in on first is size. So is it a really small bird, something on the order of a little warbler, about that size, or a small sparrow? A medium-sized bird like a thrush or a cuckoo, or is it a really large bird like a hawk or a duck? The shape is really important. Does it have a long tail? What is the shape of its bill? Does it have a curve on its bill that would indicate it's a raptor? Does it have a fine bill that might indicate that it's eating insects? Or does it have a really thick bill that looks like it's good for cracking seeds? Color is important. So birds have different color. Their bellies might be suffused with yellow, or might be a really nice white. Looking for wing bars, looking for the color on the back, whether it has an eye stripe, whether it has a crest. There are all kinds of clues that you can put together. That's another very important clue. Here we're actually hearing all kinds of different songs. So if you can learn some of the simple songs, then it can be really useful. So just here I hear chickadees, I hear an oriole, I hear song sparrows, I hear red-winged blackbirds. So the song can be really diagnostic. One thing that people tend to ignore, although they shouldn't, is habitat. So if you go to a marshland, you can expect a certain kind of bird. There, for example, was just a yellow warbler singing over my left shoulder. You can go to a forested habitat like I'm facing here, and you'll see things like that Baltimore oriole that's singing in the distance. So that's important too. Behavior is important, so characteristics of flight. So some birds, for example, that's a red-winged blackbird, giving us a little bit of a performance there. Some birds have what we call undulating flight. Some birds fly really rapidly and directly. Some birds, for example, turkey vultures, soar, so that can be a really important thing to look at. Other behaviors are the way that it's behaving in a forest if you're looking at a songbird. So some aerial insectivores, so small perching birds that eat insects, will have hawking behavior. So you'll see them at the top of a tree, and they do little loops, little forays, we call them, to catch insects. And the final thing I would say that's really important is to look at the geographical range, the maps that you see in field guides. And often people will identify a bird and they'll quite proudly announce it, and then some jerk like me will tell them that that's a West Coast bird and highly unlikely to be here. So that's a very simple way to differentiate between a likely species and an unlikely species. So I think it can be overwhelming. So we talked a little bit about the best times of year to go out. And so right now it's mid-May and it's spectacular. As I said earlier, the birding that I did this morning, there was a huge number of birds up in the treetops. And even somebody like me who's been doing this for 5 decades was a bit overwhelmed. So I think one of the most important things to do is to start with the common birds, the ones that you see in parks, the ones that you hear very commonly. Learn to diagnose those. And that allows you, in a way, to put those into the background and to identify what is unusual. So I think practicing those skills, making sure that you don't get frustrated, just sort of enjoy, take in the stuff that you do see. Every year when the robins come back in spring, I love it, or the song sparrows, and these are pretty common birds, but enjoying the common ones helps you to learn them well, and then you can move on to some of the rarer ones. So one of the things that I love about birds, and I've taught about birds all over the world, is that it is affordable. So you do need a pair of binoculars, but they need not be the really expensive kinds. When I first started bird watching seriously when I was a teenager, so starting at 13 and 14, I saved up my allowance and I bought just a relatively inexpensive pair of binoculars. You can even look for somebody who's cast them off and is not interested in their older pair of binoculars, and a field guide. And you can even get field guides in secondhand bookstores. There are lots of them. And that's really all you need, and a keen interest. So one of the things I The analogy I use in sports is soccer, or for most of the world, football. And that is really all you need is a soccer ball, or even something that looks like a soccer ball, and you can play. And even without binoculars, you can do birding. So you can see lots of things or listen to lots of things just in your backyard. And we'll talk a bit more about that, I think. So this morning I had to take a car into a garage in downtown Kingston. And so my dog and I trundled into the car that I was taking to the garage, to the mechanic, and then we walked back. And along a very busy roadway, I heard warblers, I saw sparrows, I heard some blackbirds, I heard robins. So you can birdwatch pretty well anywhere. I used to, before the pandemic, travel quite a bit. And sometimes I'd get stuck in a city for whatever reason, or I'd get stuck at an airport. And I would just exit the airport and I would birdwatch in the parking lot. Or I would take a bus or a tube to the nearest park and I would birdwatch there. Even backyards are spectacular. So I think it's a bit of a myth that you have to go to the special spots, although the special spots are special for a reason. You can do all kinds of things in city parks. You can do things in people's backyards, and even walking along a street with trees will give you that. Or go to a waterfront or a small pond if your city or town has something like that, and you'll find lots of birds. Absolutely. So one of the things that we've been doing is trying to naturalize our backyard a little bit. So we're planting shrubs and trees that produce fruit. We have flowers that will attract hummingbirds. Large blossom flowers that often are red will do a good job of attracting hummingbirds. The other thing you could do is to put out feeders at appropriate times. You can put out feeders that hold seed. If you want to attract orioles, you can put out feeders and put slices of orange, and those might bring in the Baltimore Orioles. You can put out hummingbird feeders as long as you're attentive to replacing the liquid, the sugar water inside. But all of those things will. But even just having a backyard that affords lots of cover so that birds don't feel exposed to predators, and that provides them with some food at some time of the year, will give you lots of opportunities to see things in your backyard. Well, I do remember starting. I started bird watching because of my mother and maternal grandmother when I was 8 or 9 years old. And I think one of the hardest things to do is to begin with binoculars. Binoculars are incredibly hard to use. And I remember watching what I then considered to be professional birders. And they would be looking at treetops through the binoculars, and I, for the life of me, could never see what they were looking at. And so it can be particularly frustrating. So I think there are a couple of ways that you can get children interested. One is to concentrate on sounds. Kids have more acute hearing than older adults, for example, and getting them to stand still and just listen and describe what they're hearing is one way. If you do want to introduce binoculars, which I think you should at some point, obviously, then rather than having them try to look at some little squirty thing at the very top of a tree, I think it would be really fun to make it a game, to actually focus on things that are not moving rather than moving quickly. And I think also going to look at large birds. For example, if you find a red-tailed hawk sitting in a tree, if you are respectful of distance, then you can often just spend time watching it. Or you can go to a waterfront and look at ducks and things like that. And this is a much more accessible way, I think, for kids to get into birding. So there are lots of ways. Most cities or regions have a naturalist club of some sort. So there's the Kingston Field Naturalists in our area where I grew up in the city of Guelph. There's, it used to be called the Guelph Field Naturalists. I think it's called Nature Guelph now. So one way to record them is to join a local club. There are centers. For example, there's the Natural Heritage Information Centre in Ontario, where amateurs can submit observations of birds, not just birds, but all kinds of things like turtles and snakes and frogs, and that's another venue. There also are online portals where you can get an account for free, like eBird, and you can submit your records there. And of course, it's kind of fun because there are people there who are professionals who are submitting their records, but as an amateur you can also do that, and it's a particularly useful way to submit records, and then you have a permanent account of all of the cool things that you've seen over the time. certainly the top photographers have really expensive lenses and really expensive cameras. But there are ways that you can use your phone to take a decent picture. So a lot of my students who don't have fancy cameras will actually take their binoculars, hold them up, and then they'll use their cell phone camera, and they'll take a picture through the binoculars, and it actually works pretty well. I don't have steady enough hands to be able to do that, but they seem to do it very well. The other thing is that there actually are incredibly affordable lenses that you can just clip onto your phone that are, I think, tens of dollars. And so you can get a modest telephoto lens for your cell phone that allows you to take some good pictures. And in honesty, one of the biggest virtues in photography is patience. So if you just sit still, as long as the black flies and mosquitoes aren't biting you, and wait, sometimes things will come in relatively close once they deem you not to be a threat, and you can even just use your cell phone camera to take photos.